It was a night when the stars above Los Angeles glimmered faintly, as if uncertain whether to shine or to retreat behind their dark veil. The air was still on that hillside, the gates of Cielo Drive left slightly ajar, and in that silence, footsteps sounded. They were not the careful steps of guests, nor the joyful laughter of friends. They were something else. In that quiet, in that night of August 1969, the fate of Sharon Tate and those gathered with her would be sealed, and the world would awaken to whispers of a horror that seemed beyond imagining. Welcome, dear listener, to Timeless History Documents. I invite you to take part in this shared memory across oceans and continents. Write in the comments where and when you are listening so that others may feel the presence of kindred souls. In this way, we weave a fabric of remembrance that stretches far beyond one story, binding us as a community of listeners. If you find peace and meaning in these words, consider subscribing, for your support allows this circle of memory to continue growing, and together we preserve the voices of the past. Now let us drift, not hastily but slowly, into the life and shadowed fate of Sharon Tate. For her story, though brief, is like the flicker of a candle, glowing brightly in one moment, extinguished suddenly in the next, yet leaving behind the trace of its warmth in memory. To tell her story is to move gently through moments of brightness, of promise, of laughter and hope, and also through the darker pathways of human cruelty. And as we wander, we will not rush to conclusions, nor will we judge hastily, but instead linger with the questions that rise like mist from the past. Why do some lives shine with such fragile brilliance only to be cut short, leaving us to wonder what might have been? Her tale begins not with her fame, nor with her tragedy, but with the simple act of being born into a world already shifting, already uncertain. Sharon Tate entered life in 1943 in Dallas, Texas, at the height of a global war. She was the daughter of Paul Tate, a career military officer, and of Doris, whose life was bound to the rhythm of her husband's postings. Like many children of the armed services, Sharon would grow up without a fixed place to call home. Her childhood was marked not by the comfort of familiarity, but by the transience of travel, the uprooting of friendships, and the constant reminder that life was never settled, never secure. Perhaps this was the first quiet shaping of her destiny, the sense of impermanence. For even as a young girl, Sharon was seen as unusually beautiful. Neighbors and strangers noticed her face, the gentle lines, the natural grace with which she carried herself. Yet beauty alone is not a blessing. It can isolate. It can draw unwanted attention. It can transform a child into an object before she even understands what it means. How much of Sharon's silence, her patience, her almost dreamlike aura in later life was born from those early years of being observed, admired, but rarely known? We cannot say for certain. We can only imagine the child standing by a window as the moving truck pulled away, her gaze set not on the past house, but on the road that always promised another beginning, another uncertain future. The world did not first come to know Sharon Tate through her films, nor through the glamour of Hollywood premieres, but through the shocking fragments of news on August 9th, 1969. It was a summer morning when the words spread, carried by whispers at first, then shouted through headlines and radios. A group of people, young, well-known, gathered in a home in Los Angeles, had been found slain. And at the center of the tragedy was Sharon, 8 months pregnant, a star whose career seemed only just unfolding. In those first hours, little was clear. Reporters and police alike spoke of confusion, of strange markings, of a scene so violent that words faltered. Some claimed it was a message from revolutionaries. Others said it was the madness of drug-fueled wanderers. But beneath every rumor lay the undeniable truth. Sharon Tate was dead, and with her the life of the child she carried. The world reeled not only at the crime itself, but at the symbolic loss. She was seen as the embodiment of rising beauty in cinema, the wife of director Roman Polanski, the promise of youth and motherhood, and now she had been taken, brutally, in her own home. There are moments in history when events shatter the illusion of safety. The Tate murders were such a moment. For Hollywood, it was as though a curtain had been torn away, revealing a darkness that no bright light of cinema could dispel. Until then, the hills of Los Angeles had seemed glamorous, distant, a place where stars lived above the ordinary sorrows of the world. After that night, the myth dissolved, and fear settled over the city like a heavy fog. Even the wealthiest, the most celebrated, began to question the locks on their doors, the strangers on their streets. Yet to linger only on the crime is to reduce Sharon to a victim, a name tied forever to horror. We must resist that temptation, for her life before that night was more than its tragic end. Still, the shadow cannot be avoided, for it is from that night that her story is most often remembered. So let us dwell here for a moment, not in morbid fascination, but in contemplation of how fragile human existence can be. One evening, a house is filled with laughter, with music, with the gentle movement of a woman, heavy with child, adjusting her seat as she awaits her husband's return from abroad. The next morning, that house is silent, its windows dark, its rooms echoing only with the aftermath of violence. What do we make of such fragility? Is it fate? Is it the consequence of choices we cannot see? Or is it merely the randomness of cruelty intruding upon innocence? These are questions that cannot be answered with certainty, yet they linger whenever Sharon's name is spoken. The silence that followed the chaos of that night remains one of the most haunting aspects of her story. Neighbors later said the hillside seemed too quiet, as though nature itself recoiled. Inside the house, when the frenzy ceased, there was only stillness. And it is with this stillness, this terrible and unresolved quiet, that we end this first step into Sharon Tate's story. That silence in the house after the chaos of August 1969 was not the first silence that shaped Sharon Tate's life. Long before she was known, long before her name was bound to Hollywood or tragedy, she was a child who learned to live among quiet departures. The still pauses between one place and another, the spaces left behind when life uprooted itself and moved again. Born in Dallas, Texas, in January of 1943, she was the first daughter of Paul and Doris Tate. Her father, a career officer in the United States Army, was a man of discipline and duty, and his life meant constant movement, new towns, new postings, new borders to cross. For Sharon and her family, it meant there was never one home that remained theirs, only temporary walls that echoed with their laughter until orders carried them elsewhere. Imagine her small footsteps on the wooden floors of base housing, her toys hastily packed into boxes, the sound of her mother's voice softening the unease with reassurances that they would soon arrive at another place, another room, another school. For many children, such movement might wound, but for Sharon it became a rhythm of existence. She grew accustomed to beginnings and farewells, to knowing people only briefly, to waving goodbye without promise of return. In this constant uprooting, she developed an air of patience, a quiet reserve that many would later mistake for distance or shyness. The years of her childhood stretched like a road across states and then across oceans. From Texas to Louisiana, from Washington to Italy, the Tate family followed the path the Army laid before them. The young girl was often seen by others as unusually striking, her beauty not the ordinary kind that passes unnoticed, but something luminous even in its early form. Yet beauty for a child is both gift and burden. Adults looked upon her with admiration, sometimes treating her less as a little girl than as a vision of what she might one day become. Strangers told her parents she would be famous, that she was destined for the screen. But Sharon, still a child, perhaps felt only the weight of being watched. the discomfort of eyes upon her when she wished only to belong, to blend in among her peers. There are recollections from her school years of how she was admired from afar, how boys carried photographs of her, how even teachers spoke of her loveliness. Yet she often seemed quiet, withdrawn, as though uncertain how to carry this attention. Could it be that the constant moving, the endless cycle of arrivals and departures, left her wary of deep connections, fearful of attaching herself to friendships that might dissolve with the next set of orders? She learned to smile gently, to accept admiration with grace, but also to hold part of herself inward, protected. The Tate family's time in Europe marked a deep imprint upon Sharon. In Italy, as a teenager, she walked among ruins older than the country she was born into, hearing languages she did not understand, feeling both the wonder and the alienation of being foreign. There is a photograph of her at 16, crowned as a beauty queen in Verona, wearing a sash that marked her as the local pageant's choice. She stood radiant, yet behind the brightness of her smile one might sense her unease. Was this truly her identity, or was it a role pressed upon her by circumstance, by the expectations of others? Perhaps even then she knew that beauty could open doors, yet it could also close them, fixing a person in an image that left little room for the soul beneath. Her father's duties meant she was often surrounded by the world of discipline, uniforms, and obedience, a world in which her own gentleness seemed almost out of place. Doris, her mother, protected her with affection and steadiness, providing the consistency that geography denied. The bond between Sharon and her mother was said to be deep and unwavering, a connection that later years would show to be a source of strength, even after unspeakable loss. At each new posting, Sharon would carry with her the same quiet curiosity. Neighbors recalled her as polite, reserved, never boastful despite the attention she received. Teachers saw in her not only beauty, but kindness, a willingness to befriend those who felt out of place. And perhaps this was the hidden gift of her transient childhood. She knew what it meant to be new, to be the outsider, and so she carried empathy for others who felt unseen. Yet beneath it all was the silence of car rides toward another unknown city, the silence of rooms packed hastily into boxes, the silence of friendships fading like voices heard across a train platform as it pulls away. These early silences prepared her for the roles life would later demand of her. The patient young actress waiting for recognition, the devoted wife waiting for her husband's return from long absences, the expectant mother waiting for the child she would never hold. What is it that shapes us more? The places we live or the leaving of them? Is identity formed by what we cling to or by what we lose along the way? In Sharon's early years, we glimpse not only the beauty that captured the attention of others, but the unspoken melancholy of a child who was always in transit, always somewhere between belonging and departure. The horizon was her constant companion, visible from the back seat of the car as one chapter closed and another began. She looked out at distant hills, at foreign skylines, at landscapes she did not yet know, and within her the seed of longing took root. Longing for stability, for a place to rest, for a life not carried endlessly forward by orders and duty. Perhaps this longing gave her later years their dreamlike quality, as if she were forever searching for a stillness that life denied her. And so the silence of Cielo Drive, the silence of tragedy, can be traced back to the silences of her childhood, moments of waiting, of watching, of accepting the impermanence of things. The girl by the window, gazing at another horizon she did not choose, would one day become the woman remembered for her luminous yet fleeting presence. The echo of foreign voices filled Sharon's adolescence, sounds of languages she could not yet shape into meaning. In Italy, where her father's assignments carried the family during her teenage years, she often stood quietly at the edge of gatherings, hearing laughter and conversation ripple through the air like waves she could not enter. The syllables were music yet mystery, and within them she felt the familiar sensation of being both present and apart, visible yet unseen. To be admired for her beauty was one thing, to be understood in her essence was another, and too often it seemed the latter remained out of reach. Verona, Vicenza, Padua, names of cities that were to her less than home and more like passing stations, each holding fragments of her youth. She walked on cobblestone streets where shadows of ancient walls stretched long in the evening light, and she learned the strangeness of belonging everywhere and nowhere at once. For many who encountered her, the impression was immediate. Here was a girl of remarkable loveliness, a face that seemed destined for the silver screen, a bearing that invited admiration without effort. Yet in Sharon's own silence one might sense a different truth, that she was still learning how to wear this gaze, still wondering what it meant to be so noticed, yet so often alone. In 1959, at the age of 16, she entered a beauty pageant in Verona and was crowned queen, her image preserved in photographs that show her draped in a sash, her hair gleaming beneath the lights. To outsiders, this moment seemed confirmation that her destiny was unfolding, that the world would open itself to her. But how did Sharon herself feel, standing there with applause filling the hall, voices speaking words she scarcely understood? Perhaps it was flattering, perhaps it was bewildering, perhaps both at once. What is certain is that even in her triumph, she remained modest, speaking little, smiling with the shy reserve that marked her character. Those who knew her then remembered not a girl intoxicated by attention, but one who carried it lightly, almost reluctantly. Friends later said she was hesitant to step fully into the spotlight, as though she sensed that beauty, once claimed, could become a cage as much as a gift. Could it be that this was the seed of her later gentleness? The way she would move through Hollywood without arrogance, without bitterness, as though aware that her appearance was a path offered but not entirely chosen? Life in Europe broadened her in other ways too. She absorbed the art and architecture, the echoes of history in every piazza and cathedral. To be surrounded by centuries of human striving, by monuments that outlived their makers, may have deepened her own reflective nature. She learned to see herself not only as a young woman of a transient family, but as part of a longer human story, where beauty and ruin often stood side by side. The ruins of Rome, the frescoes of Florence, the hushed reverence of old churches, all these were whispers to a soul that often seemed more contemplative than her peers imagined. Yet for all the richness of Europe, the silences remained. When she returned home after evenings out, her reflections were likely her only companions. She wrote letters, kept her thoughts guarded, and learned how to present a face to the world that was gracious but veiled. In this way, adolescence prepared her for the roles ahead, to stand before the camera and offer what others wished to see, while holding within herself a gentleness too fragile for constant display. She longed, perhaps unconsciously, for permanence, the constant shifting from one school to another, the loss of friends with each departure, instilled in her a longing for roots. And so when Hollywood later offered her its strange promise of permanence, fame, recognition, a name fixed in memory, it is little wonder that she drifted toward it, even if part of her remained cautious. Fame seemed at least to promise that she would be remembered, not merely passed by like a guest in foreign towns. Her adolescence in Europe was also a period of awakening to possibility. Though she carried shyness, she also carried dreams. Her parents noticed how naturally she fit the role of admired figure, how the camera loved her, how strangers lingered on her presence. They wondered, as did many others, whether her path would lead to the stage or screen. Yet Sharon herself remained unsure, For every step forward, she hesitated, questioning if this was her true calling or simply the shape others wished her to assume. What, then, does it mean to belong to no single place? Does one become a mirror, reflecting the expectations of others, or does one grow into a deeper self, shaped by the silence of in-between spaces? Sharon's youth in Europe suggests she became a blend of both, a mirror to the world's admiration, and yet within that mirror, a soul quietly asking for more. The echo of voices she could not understand still lingers in the memory of her story. They remind us of how often she stood poised between comprehension and mystery, between presence and absence, between being seen and being known. And just as those voices faded into the air of foreign streets, so too would other voices later surround her in Hollywood, voices of directors, producers, admirers, all speaking, all demanding, yet not all perceiving the gentle truth within her. And as we leave her teenage years behind, let us pause with the image of Sharon walking alone through a narrow street in Italy, the sound of church bells marking the evening hour, foreign voices echoing around her. She walks with grace. She walks with beauty. But she also walks with silence, her thoughts her own, her destiny unknown, her heart carrying both the weight of attention and the longing for a place to call home. The flash of a camera, freezing Sharon's smile in a moment of still light, marked the next passage of her life. From the streets of Italy, where voices had been foreign and echoes had accompanied her steps, she now found herself stepping into the world of images, a world that sought to capture and preserve her beauty for others to see. Modeling was among her earliest introductions to Hollywood, though at first it was not Hollywood itself, but the modest beginning of magazine spreads, commercial work, and promotional images that placed her face before strangers who would never know her name. The flashbulb, blinding yet brief, gave her an awareness that in this new world her likeness could travel farther than her voice, farther than her story, and she would need to learn to live with the way others would see her. There is a paradox to such beginnings. A photograph preserves what seems eternal, but it also erases the movement, the hesitation, the complexity of the subject. Sharon, still finding her way in early adulthood, still uncertain whether this path was truly hers, was already being reduced into the singular image of a beautiful young woman. Did she feel pride, or did she feel the weight of invisibility beneath the surface of recognition? Her smile, caught in black and white, might have concealed the same quiet reserve that had marked her childhood. She was now surrounded not by foreign voices, but by the demands of photographers and casting directors. Yet the sensation of being misunderstood may have remained the same. Small roles began to come her way. At first, these were appearances so brief, they scarcely left a mark on audiences. Yet they signaled to Sharon that perhaps Hollywood was the place where she might finally find permanence. In television commercials, she played the part of the smiling beauty, offering products with a grace that caught the eye. In promotional stills, she appeared alongside actors who would overshadow her, yet her presence remained luminous, impossible to ignore entirely. The struggle was one familiar to countless young women in that era, to be recognized not only for appearance, but for depth, for talent, for what lay beyond the surface. And yet the industry was relentless in its appetite for surfaces, for images, for the quick consumption of youth and charm. Her earliest film work reflected this tension. There were background parts, uncredited appearances, moments where she served as ornament more than character. Friends and colleagues would later recall that she accepted these roles without complaint, with patience, as though she understood that her path required first endurance. She was not loud in ambition, not forceful in demanding recognition, but gentle, waiting, perhaps hoping that in time she would be given the chance to show more than her smile. That patience, however, was double-edged. In a world where the loud and the insistent were often rewarded, Sharon's quiet grace may have been mistaken for passivity. Yet it was her nature, a continuation of the reserve shaped by years of impermanence, of never claiming space too forcefully for fear it might vanish. The flash of the camera was joined by the call of the director, the command of action, and then cut. For Sharon, those words may have carried a strange resonance. Action invited her into the illusion of belonging, a chance to inhabit a character, however small the role. Cut returned her to herself, to the waiting, to the silence between opportunities. In those early years, her career seemed to hover between promise and uncertainty, as if she were forever standing on the threshold of recognition, but never quite permitted to step fully inside. Yet even in these beginnings, those who worked with her remembered a quality that lingered. She had a presence that was not easily dismissed, not merely beauty, for Hollywood was filled with beautiful faces, but a softness, a humanity that gave her screen time a lingering effect. Even in small roles, she seemed less an image than a person, and perhaps that was why audiences, even when they did not yet know her name, found themselves drawn to her. Still, Sharon remained cautious. She was not one to boast of her ambitions, not one to rush recklessly forward. She had seen too much of life's impermanence to place all her hope in a single dream. And yet she continued, step by step, photograph by photograph, appearance by appearance, as though sensing that her path was unfolding before her, whether or not she declared it. There is a quiet inevitability in her story at this stage, the sense that Hollywood itself had noticed her, and though it might take years, it would not let her go. The paradox of being noticed and yet unknown defined these years. To the casual viewer, she was another lovely face, one among many. To those who looked closer, there was something unmistakable, a vulnerability that invited sympathy, a gentleness that refused to harden itself against the demands of the industry. This quality, so rare in the world she was entering, would one day become her defining presence on screen. But for now, it meant she was both everywhere and nowhere, present yet overlooked, a figure frozen in flashes of light, but not yet fully alive in the imagination of audiences. The camera's flash fades quickly, leaving afterimages on the eyes. So too did these early roles leave traces, but not yet permanence. Sharon's life in this stage was one of waiting, of gathering experiences, of learning to move gracefully through an industry that often cared more for the image than for the soul. Did she wonder, in her private reflections, whether she was truly on the right path? Did she ask herself if the constant smiling, the endless posing, the fleeting roles were enough, or whether they were only preparation for something more? Her story in these years is not one of triumph or despair, but of patience, of inhabiting the threshold. It is the story of a young woman whose beauty was already recognized, yet whose personhood remained elusive to those around her. The smile captured by the camera was hers, but the meaning behind it was something she held quietly within, unspoken, perhaps waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And as we leave this part of her story, we do so with the image of that camera flash, a brief burst of light freezing her smile, leaving us uncertain of what she truly felt behind it. The echo of the director's voice fades into silence, the word cut hanging in the air, and in that silence, Sharon waits once again, poised between recognition and obscurity, between promise and fulfillment. The echo of the director's voice calling cut seemed to linger in Sharon's early years in film, a word that marked not only the end of a scene, but also the reminder of how temporary her roles were. She appeared on sets where her presence was asked for, admired, and then quickly dismissed. The word cut was both command and boundary, telling her that her contribution was sufficient for the moment, yet also that it was not yet her time to be fully heard. In those days, she was often cast as the beautiful figure who adorned the background, the smiling young woman whose task was to illuminate a frame without altering its story. Her first notable roles came gradually, small parts that placed her before audiences but gave her little voice. In the series The Beverly Hillbillies, she appeared as Janet Trego, a secretary, graceful and appealing but not central. The show's lighthearted humor did not require her to reveal her inner depth, only to embody the charm of the attractive young woman who existed at the margins of the plot. To viewers, she was delightful. To producers, she was useful. But to Sharon herself, it may have been another reminder that beauty was a mask she was asked to wear, not yet a full identity she could shape into art. Film followed with similar patterns. In Eye of the Devil, she appeared with an otherworldly aura. Her role cloaked in mystery and ritual, yet again defined largely by how she looked rather than by who she was within. Audiences and critics alike remarked on her striking presence, how the camera adored her, but the praise was often limited to the surface. It was as though her essence remained veiled, even as her image was displayed. In these years, Sharon's challenge was the paradox of beauty. It opened every door, yet kept her confined to a narrow corridor. Hollywood of the 1960s was eager for faces that could decorate the screen, but hesitant to believe that such faces might also hold depth, intelligence, subtlety. The more she was admired, the more she risked being reduced to an image, to a reflection of what others wanted to see. And so, with patience, she bore the mask of beauty, even as she longed for the chance to be recognized for the soul behind it. Those who worked with her often recalled her kindness, her humility, the way she carried herself without arrogance despite constant attention. She was known for treating crew members with respect, for speaking gently, for being present without demanding. In this way, her mask of beauty was not a hard shell but a translucent veil. Behind it, one could sense the warmth of her character, though not everyone paused long enough to perceive it. The industry, with its rush for glamour and novelty, was rarely patient enough to look beneath. What did Sharon feel in these moments? Leaving the set after another small role, hearing her name mentioned briefly in reviews that praised her loveliness but said little else. Did she sit quietly with herself, wondering if this was her fate, to be remembered only for her face? Or did she hope, with the resilience she had carried since childhood, that each role was a step, however small, towards something greater? The image of her on set, waiting between takes, is one that speaks to the rhythm of her early career. Surrounded by lights, cameras, voices, she often remained still, observing, reflecting. She was learning, not only about acting, but about the nature of the world she had entered. It was a world that devoured beauty quickly, that replaced one face with another, that prized appearance over endurance. Sharon's gentleness, her patience, may have been her way of resisting this pace, of refusing to be consumed too quickly. The mask of beauty, however, was not only imposed upon her by others. In some ways, she wore it willingly as a protection. To reveal one's inner self in such an unforgiving world was dangerous. Perhaps she knew that keeping her depth veiled allowed her to move safely through these early years, preserving the parts of herself that were not yet ready to be exposed. The smile she gave to the camera, the grace with which she accepted each role, may have been both offering and shield. It is worth asking, is beauty ever truly seen, or is it only ever interpreted, refracted through the desires of those who behold it? Sharon's story at this stage suggests the latter. Each director, each photographer, each audience member saw in her what they wished. To some, she was the perfect ingenue, to others, the mysterious enchantress, to still others, the ornamental presence who adorned a frame. But who was she to herself? That question, elusive and haunting, follows us through her life. The repetition of cut at the end of each small scene may have echoed in her own mind. Each role ended before it began, each opportunity cut short of revelation. Yet she did not retreat. She remained, she continued, She endured the waiting. Her patience, often mistaken for passivity, was in truth a quiet strength, for only through endurance could she arrive at the roles that would one day allow her more space, more voice, more presence. And so we see her in these years as a young actress walking out of the studio lot at dusk, her shadow stretching long in the fading light, her thoughts unspoken. Around her the city hummed with ambition, with competition, with hunger. Within her there was stillness, a determination that was gentle but not weak, patient but not resigned. She wore the mask of beauty because she must, but behind it, her spirit awaited its moment. The director's call of cut fades into memory once more, leaving her alone with herself. The lights are turned off, the set dismantled, the day concluded. But Sharon's story was only beginning, and even in these small parts, the camera had recorded something unforgettable. Though reduced in words to her appearance, her presence lingered with those who saw her, as though her soul had whispered through the mask despite the industry's blindness. And so this part of her life closes not with triumph nor despair, but with the unresolved tension of being both admired and overlooked, both present and unseen. The echo of cut remains, a reminder of the fragility of beginnings, and with it we step forward, awaiting the moment when the applause of strangers would grow louder, when the veil of small roles would give way to a more luminous recognition. The applause of strangers fading into night marked a turning point in Sharon's path, a sound both thrilling and fragile, as fleeting as the echo of a dream. It was with Valley of the Dolls in 1967 that she stepped out of the shadows of small roles and into the brightness of larger recognition. The film, adapted from Jacqueline Suzanne's popular novel, carried with it a mix of scandal and allure, promising audiences a glimpse into the turbulent undercurrents of fame and desire. For Sharon, the role of Jennifer North was more than another assignment. It was the opportunity to embody a character whose fate seemed eerily intertwined with her own, though neither she nor the world yet understood the haunting symmetry. Jennifer North was a woman admired for her beauty, yet dismissed for the same reason. She longed for acknowledgement beyond her appearance, sought to be loved for more than her surface, but found herself constantly reduced to what others saw. Sharon played the part with a gentleness that blurred the line between character and self. Viewers who knew nothing of her life could sense the authenticity in her performance. The vulnerability was not entirely scripted. It seemed to emanate from within her, as though Sharon herself were whispering through Jennifer's sorrow. The film itself received mixed reviews. Critics often found it melodramatic, its performances exaggerated, its plot indulgent. But audiences flocked to it, drawn by its glamour and scandal, and Sharon's presence became one of its most enduring impressions. She was radiant, yet beneath the radiance there was a sadness that lingered long after the film ended. In this way, she achieved what she had longed for in her early career. She was not merely seen, but felt. The applause of strangers may have been ephemeral, fading into the night once the lights dimmed, but it marked the moment when her name carried more weight, when her image began to settle in the public imagination. Still, the paradox of recognition persisted. Success brought her fame, but fame carried its own masks. Interviews after Valley of the Dolls often returned to her beauty, her allure, her physical perfection. Sharon, patient as always, responded with humility, with that quiet grace that had followed her since childhood. Yet one can almost imagine her sighing inwardly, longing for questions that asked about her soul, her thoughts, her ambitions, rather than the simple repetition of admiration for her face. She bore it gently, for she had learned to endure, but the ache of being misunderstood may have remained. What is the nature of applause? It rises suddenly, overwhelming, then dissipates into silence. For the actor, it is both validation and emptiness. Sharon may have felt this keenly. On the set, she poured herself into her role, gave her vulnerability freely, and for a time the applause embraced her. But when the lights dimmed, when the crowd dispersed, she was once again left with herself, her thoughts, her longing for permanence. Was the applause enough to quiet that longing, or did it only intensify it, reminding her of how fleeting recognition can be? Yet amid the mixed chorus of critics and admirers, Sharon found herself welcomed more deeply into Hollywood's circle. Invitations came more readily, her name appeared more frequently, and her presence at events was sought. She began to carry herself with more confidence, though never with arrogance. Friends noted that fame did not harden her. She remained kind, approachable, gentle with those who approached her, as though aware that admiration was not hers to command, but hers to receive with humility. In this, she was unlike many of her contemporaries. The world wanted glamour, scandal, bold declarations. Sharon offered instead warmth, sincerity, and patience. In Valley of the Dolls, Jennifer North's fate was tragic. An actress consumed by despair, her life ended too soon. Some who viewed the film later would remark on the eerie foreshadowing, the way Sharon seemed almost to embody her own destiny. But to dwell on such parallels too heavily is to risk turning her life into myth rather than memory. At the time, she was simply a young actress who had found her breakthrough, who had finally been given space to reveal more than her surface. She may have sensed the shadows in the role, but she also knew the satisfaction of at last being noticed, not just for her beauty, but for her performance. The applause faded as all applause does, but in its fading, Sharon was left with a clearer sense of her path. She would continue to seek roles that allowed her to show more, though the industry was slow to provide them. She would continue to carry her gentleness into a world often indifferent to it. And she would continue to wait, patient as always, for the next opportunity, the next moment when the mask might slip and her true presence shine through. The applause, fading into night, leaves us with an image of Sharon stepping away from the premiere, the crowd's voices still echoing faintly behind her. She walks into the cool evening, her dress shimmering under the streetlights, her face calm, her heart perhaps still wondering what permanence could ever be found in such fleeting noise. Her footsteps from the premiere, her face still calm in the fading echoes of applause, led her not only further into Hollywood, but also toward the fateful laughter of a man who would become both partner and companion. The laughter of Roman Polanski was unlike the applause of strangers. It was sharp, witty, playful, filled with the energy of a man who lived in constant pursuit of creation and surprise. Sharon first encountered him through the world of film, where paths cross in ways that sometimes seem accidental and yet feel like inevitability. Their meeting unfolded in the mid-1960s, a period when Polanski was rising as a daring new director, and Sharon was stepping more firmly into the light of recognition. He was unlike the men she had known before. Roman carried the air of a restless visionary, a European sensibility sharpened by his own troubled past, a survivor of war whose childhood had been marked by devastation. His gaze, quick and discerning, sought not only beauty but originality. When he looked at Sharon, perhaps he saw more than her luminous presence. Perhaps he saw in her a gentleness that contrasted with his own sharpness, a serenity that balanced his chaos. For Sharon, his laughter was disarming, his brilliance captivating, his unpredictability both thrilling and unsettling. Their courtship was marked by contradictions. Roman was bold, sometimes irreverent, living with an edge that fascinated and at times frustrated those around him. Sharon, in contrast, moved with patience, with a softness that seemed to slow the pace of the world. Together they created a rhythm that was part harmony, part dissonance. Friends recalled moments of joy between them, shared playfulness that filled rooms with laughter, but also moments of tension when Sharon's quiet nature clashed with Roman's restlessness. And yet, despite these contrasts, there was magnetism. the undeniable pull of two people whose differences created a kind of balance neither could resist. In 1967, Sharon took a role in Roman's film The Fearless Vampire Killers. It was both a professional step and a deeply personal one, for in the collaboration their relationship grew. On screen, she appeared as Sarah, the innkeeper's daughter whose beauty captures the attention of vampires and mortals alike. Off-screen, her connection with Roman deepened, and their lives began to entwine in ways that blurred the line between work and love. The film itself was whimsical, filled with gothic humor and visual flair, and though critics were divided, it remains notable as the project that sealed their bond. There is a story told of Sharon and Roman laughing together on set, their laughter echoing down stairwells, carrying the warmth of new companionship. It is this laughter, more than the film's reception, that matters in the memory of her life. For Sharon, whose early years had been shaped by silence and transience, to share such laughter may have felt like the stability she had long yearned for, even if Roman's nature meant that stability was often precarious. She gave herself to the relationship with the same gentleness she gave to everything, not demanding, not loud, but present, loyal, enduring. Marriage was not immediate, but the bond between them grew undeniable. Roman's brilliance attracted her, his daring amused her, and his affection, when offered, seemed to fill the space of her longing. For Roman, Sharon represented light, a beauty both serene and radiant, a partner who could soften his sharp edges. Yet the differences between them never disappeared. Roman was known for his intensity, his indulgences, his difficulty with fidelity, while Sharon carried with her a desire for home, for roots, for the quiet happiness of belonging. These contrasts would shape their marriage in ways both tender and troubled. Still, in these years their relationship shone with promise. They were young, admired also as a couple, photographed together at events, their glamour noted by magazines and fans. Sharon's career continued to develop, though often overshadowed by Roman's rising stature as a filmmaker. Yet she seemed content in her role, proud of his accomplishments, eager to support him even when her own ambitions were set aside. This willingness was not weakness but devotion, an extension of her nature that sought harmony over conflict, love over self-assertion. The laughter they shared became the thread that wove them together through moments of uncertainty. Laughter in stairwells, laughter at parties, laughter in the intimacy of private moments. Yet beneath the laughter lay questions that would linger. Could such different natures truly build a lasting home together? Could Sharon's longing for permanence withstand Roman's restlessness? Could her gentleness survive the turbulence of his world? These questions would not be answered quickly, but they would hover like distant clouds on the horizon of their union. For now, however, the memory of their courtship is best left with its brightness. Two figures walking together down the corridors of studios, their voices mingling in laughter, their future not yet shadowed. Sharon, radiant in her patience, Roman, quick in his wit, their steps echoing as if in harmony. The applause of strangers had faded, but in its place Sharon had found something more personal, more intimate. The laughter of companionship, the promise of love. And so this part of her story closes with that laughter still lingering, echoing down stairwells, fading slowly into the quiet of evening, carrying with it both joy and uncertainty, both warmth and the faint whisper of questions, yet unresolved. The soft fall of a wedding confetti in London marked a chapter that shimmered with celebration and promise, though beneath its brightness were the subtle shadows of imbalance. On January 20th, 1968, Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski wed at Chelsea Register Office, surrounded by the admiration of the press and the delight of friends. The confetti drifted slowly, catching in her hair, clinging to her dress, dissolving into the damp air of an English winter. For a moment it seemed as though permanence had finally come to Sharon, who had lived so much of her life in transience. She looked radiant, her face calm with the serenity of one who believes she has found a home in the embrace of another. Roman stood beside her, quick in wit even on his wedding day, his eyes alive with the restless spark that defined him. Together they appeared to the world as a couple, touched by glamour and destiny, a pairing of beauty and brilliance. Photographs captured them smiling, Sharon luminous in her gown, Roman mischievous in expression, and for those who saw the images, the story seemed clear. Two young stars, their futures entwined, their life together just beginning. Yet the truth, as always, was more complex. Roman carried within him the scars of a childhood shaped by war, the restless ambition of a filmmaker who could never remain still. Sharon carried within her the longing for stability, for a place to belong after years of impermanence. Their marriage, like the confetti that clung briefly and then melted away, was a union of contrasts, fragile in its balance. Their time together in London was filled with laughter, parties, late nights, and the company of the fashionable circles that surrounded Roman. Sharon, gracious and patient, moved easily within this world, admired wherever she went, though her heart was often more inclined toward the quiet intimacy of home. Roman by nature was drawn outward to the thrill of new experiences, to the creative spark that flared in the presence of others. Friends noticed the difference between them. Sharon was warm, devoted, steady in her affection. Roman was brilliant, unpredictable, sometimes distant, sometimes overwhelming. Yet despite the imbalance, there was love. Sharon loved Roman with a devotion that many observed, a loyalty that endured even when his restlessness created tension. Roman, though not always consistent in his affections, spoke of Sharon as his great love, admiring her beauty, her gentleness, her capacity to forgive. In moments together, they found harmony, a blend of her patience and his energy, her calm and his fire. Their marriage was not simple, not free from discord, but it was theirs, and in its contradictions it held the essence of their natures. For Sharon, the marriage was a dream realized. She had often spoken of her desire to be a wife and mother, to create a home, to build permanence in a life that had long been transient. With Roman, she believed she had found the partner who would share that dream. She looked ahead with hope, imagining children, imagining a home filled with warmth. Roman, though less inclined toward domesticity, seemed for a time to share her vision, or at least to bask in the comfort her devotion provided. The months after their marriage carried both joy and unease. They traveled, they worked, they lived amid the constant presence of Hollywood and European society. Sharon's career continued to rise, though she often placed Roman's needs before her own, joining him in his work, supporting his ambitions, adjusting her life to his rhythms. To some, this seemed a sacrifice, but to Sharon it was natural. She loved not in halves but in wholes, offering herself fully without reservation, and yet the subtle shadows remained. Roman was known for his flirtations, his reluctance to embrace the traditional roles of husband and father. Sharon, though patient, could not have been unaware of these tendencies. Friends spoke of moments when her eyes betrayed a quiet sadness, a longing for more steadiness than Roman was able to provide. But she did not confront with anger. Instead, she endured, perhaps hoping that in time, love would soften his restlessness, that her devotion would create the stability she longed for. The image of confetti falling on their wedding day lingers as a symbol of their union. Bright, delicate, beautiful, yet fleeting, vulnerable to the wind and the rain. Their marriage was filled with moments of tenderness, moments of laughter that echoed as they had in their courtship. But it was also filled with unanswered questions. Could Sharon's longing for permanence find its place in Roman's restless world? Could his brilliance, always chasing the next creation, settle into the stillness of home? These questions hung in the air, unresolved, even as the couple presented to the world the image of happiness. For those who saw them, photographed them, interviewed them, theirs was a story of glamour and love. For Sharon, it was more intimate, more complex, yet still filled with hope. She held to her dream, even when reality wavered, for her nature was one of patience, of gentleness, of belief in love's power to endure. And so we leave this part of her story with the image of Sharon standing outside the registry office in London, confetti falling softly, her smile serene, her hand in Roman's. The moment is beautiful, suspended in time, yet already fading like the confetti that melts into the damp pavement. The laughter of friends and well-wishers lingers, but beneath it we sense the faint whisper of imbalance, of questions left unanswered, of a future both bright and uncertain. The confetti that clung to her hair on that winter day in London dissolved into memory, but another image began to form, more intimate and radiant, Sharon's hand resting gently on her unborn child. It was in the months that followed, when she and Roman moved into their home on Cielo Drive, that this vision of motherhood became her deepest joy. For all her years of transience, of being uprooted and observed, she longed for a place of belonging, a permanence that could only be found in the love of family. And now, at last, that dream seemed close, for she carried within her the life that she had so often spoken of with hope. She was seen in those months glowing with expectation, her face serene, her movement slow with the grace of a woman awaiting the birth of her first child. Friends recalled how she spoke of the nursery, how she dreamed of holding her baby, how her hands lingered upon her growing belly as if in constant conversation with the life within. To Sharon, motherhood was not a burden, but a fulfillment. The deepest answer to the longing that had marked her since childhood. She would finally have what her transient upbringing had denied: stability, continuity, a home filled with the warmth of her own family. Roman, however, remained divided. His devotion to Sharon was real, yet his nature was restless, consumed by his work and his desires. While Sharon dreamed of permanence, he moved with the unpredictability of a man who belonged as much to the world as to his wife. He traveled often, leaving Sharon behind in Los Angeles, while he worked abroad, particularly in London where projects demanded his presence. Friends noticed the contrast. Sharon, gentle and patient, surrounding herself with companions, planning for the child's arrival. Roman, distant at times, returning briefly only to depart again, his focus divided between love and ambition. Yet Sharon bore this with the same patience that had defined her life. She did not complain loudly, nor did she confront harshly. She waited, she hoped. She believed that love could bridge the distance. Her letters to Roman revealed affection, longing, and trust, even as they carried the quiet undertone of loneliness. She wanted him beside her, not for glamour or appearances, but for the intimacy of sharing the moments of expectation, the small joys and fears that come with awaiting new life. Those who visited her at Cielo Drive during this time described a home that carried her gentle presence. She decorated with care. She welcomed friends warmly. She created an atmosphere of lightness and calm. Even as her body grew heavy with pregnancy, she moved with grace. Her beauty deepened rather than diminished by the new life she carried. There was a radiance about her, as though the fulfillment of her dream shone from within. To those who saw her, she seemed to embody hope itself, the quiet promise of continuity in a world that often felt fractured. Yet there was also a shadow. Sharon's longing for Roman's constant presence went largely unfulfilled. He remained abroad through much of her pregnancy, leaving her surrounded by friends but without the partner she so desired. She endured as she always did, but the ache of absence weighed upon her. Friends later recalled moments when her eyes betrayed this longing, when she spoke softly of her wish for him to return, when she confessed her loneliness. Still, she did not let bitterness take root. She believed in love, in patience, in the dream that once the child was born, once their home was filled with new life, Roman too would find the stability she yearned for. There is an image of her during this time, seated in her living room, a gentle smile upon her face, her hand resting on her belly. Sunlight streams through the window, illuminating her in a soft glow, as if nature itself were blessing her anticipation. This image captures the essence of Sharon in these months: serene, hopeful, radiant with the expectation of motherhood. For her, this was the fulfillment of years of longing, the promise that her transient life had not been in vain. She was about to create her own permanence, her own home, her own family. But fate, as always, is complex. The very home that she hoped would be her sanctuary, the place where she imagined raising her child, would become the place of her undoing. The joy of expectation, the serenity of waiting, was shadowed by forces she could not see, forces gathering at the edges of her world, forces that would one day shatter the dream she held so close. And yet, it would be wrong to dwell already upon that shadow. For in this part of her story, the image of Sharon is one of light, of tenderness, of hope. Her hand upon her unborn child, her heart filled with dreams, her soul glowing with anticipation. The imbalance of her marriage, the loneliness of Roman's absence, these were real, but they did not extinguish her hope. She carried within her not only life, but the belief that love could endure, that family could heal, that permanence could finally be hers. We leave her here for now, seated in that sunlit room, her hand resting gently on her unborn child, her eyes calm, her smile serene. The silence of her waiting is filled with hope, with dreams unspoken, with the tender rhythm of life yet to be born. The image of Sharon seated in her sunlit room, her hand resting gently on her unborn child, begins to dissolve, and in its place another image arises: the drift of desert dust carried into the city. By 1969, Los Angeles was no longer only the glamorous world of film premieres and star-studded parties. It had become a city of contrasts, where the brightness of Hollywood Hills coexisted with shadows that crept in from the outskirts, from the deserts and forgotten places beyond. The atmosphere was shifting, restless, as if the very air of California carried with it both the golden glow of promise and the grit of unease. This was the late 1960s, a time when America itself trembled with change. The war in Vietnam weighed heavily upon the conscience of the nation. Protests filled the streets, voices rose against institutions, young people rejected the patterns of their parents and sought new ways of living, of believing, of belonging. In Los Angeles, these currents converged with the unique magnetism of Hollywood. The city was both stage and mirror, reflecting the upheaval of the age, while also amplifying it with its own illusions. For those who lived in its hills, the glamour seemed unchanged. Yet just beyond the gates, a tide of unrest and counterculture was flowing steadily inward. Sharon, radiant in her pregnancy, may have felt little of this directly, yet the city around her was shifting in ways that would touch her fate. The late 60s brought with them not only art and music, but also discontent and disillusionment. The summer of love had given way to darker seasons. Communities formed on the fringes, bands of young men and women who sought new visions of freedom, who abandoned homes, who gathered around charismatic figures promising revelation. In the canyons and deserts around Los Angeles, these groups lived outside the ordinary rhythms of society, their presence often dismissed as eccentric or irrelevant by those in the polished neighborhoods of Beverly Hills and Bel Air. But the dust from the desert does not remain in the desert. It drifts, carried by wind, settling upon the polished cars and manicured lawns, reminding those who live in comfort that the world beyond their gates is never truly separate. By 1969, Los Angeles carried both extremes: wealth and poverty, glamour and despair, creation and destruction. It was in this mingling of opposites that the stage was set for what would come. For Sharon, the days were filled with anticipation, with decorating her nursery, with welcoming friends, with gentle gatherings at Cielo Drive. Yet the city around her hummed with dissonance. The young spoke of revolution, of tearing down the old order. Music carried messages of both hope and rage. The newspapers carried stories of violence, of protest, of unrest that seemed far from her hillside, but was, in truth, drawing nearer. She may not have known, as she walked through her home, as she arranged baby clothes, that only a few miles away other lives were being shaped by a very different dream, one of darkness disguised as freedom, one of destruction masquerading as purpose. Hollywood itself reflected these contradictions. On one hand, it remained a world of premieres and parties, of laughter and glitter. On the other, it had become a symbol of everything the counterculture resisted: the wealth, the artifice, the illusion of happiness. All these were rejected by those who sought to live in communes, to abandon materialism, to follow leaders who promised transcendence beyond the world of money and fame. Sharon, as a rising star, embodied the very image of the Hollywood ideal. Unknowingly, she also embodied the target for those who despised it. It is haunting to reflect on this, to imagine Sharon preparing for motherhood, serene and hopeful, while the city beyond her gates carried whispers of discontent that would one day reach her doorstep. Did she sense it in the air, in the strange unease that seemed to grow as 1969 advanced? Did she notice, when driving through the streets, the gatherings of youth who looked upon the world with defiance rather than admiration? Or was she shielded by her world of friends, of preparation, of patient waiting? The answers are lost to us, but the questions linger, like dust that clings even when brushed aside. The late 60s were not only a time of upheaval, but also of transition in art, music, and film. Sharon, caught between the innocence of Hollywood's golden era and the turbulence of its transformation, stood at a crossroads she did not choose. The culture around her was shifting from light to shadow, from simplicity to cynicism. The roles she might have played in the years to come could have reflected this change, showing her depth beyond beauty, her gentleness amid chaos. But history denied her that chance. For now, in this part of her story, we see her as the still center within a restless city. Her home was her sanctuary, her pregnancy, her focus, her love for Roman, her anchor, however distant he sometimes seemed. Around her, Los Angeles shimmered with both glamour and foreboding. The desert dust drifted into the city, settling quietly unnoticed by many. Yet in that dust were the seeds of what was to come, the shadows that would one day fall across her light. And so we leave Sharon here in the early months of 1969, her hand upon her unborn child, her home filled with light, her heart filled with expectation. Beyond her gates, the city hums with unrest, the air thick with contradictions, the desert dust already drifting across its bright facades. The desert dust that drifted into the city carried with it more than grit. It carried voices, songs, and whispers from the fringes of society. Among those whispers was the low hum of a strange melody, a tune sung by a man whose presence unsettled even as it fascinated. This was Charles Manson, a figure who gathered around him a band of young followers, weaving together fragments of music, scripture, and delusion into a vision that drew others into his orbit. His world, chaotic and disordered, stood in stark contrast to the serene expectation of Sharon's life at Cielo Drive, and yet fate would entwine them. Manson was not, at first, a figure of fear to the city at large. He presented himself as a seeker of truth, a man of music, a prophet for those who had grown disillusioned with the promises of conventional life. His followers, many of them young women who had left behind families and futures, found in him the father, lover, and savior they longed for. To them, his low songs carried meaning, his words offered purpose, his gaze held the promise of belonging. They called themselves a family, though what bound them was not love in its pure form, but a distorted imitation, shaped by control and submission. In Los Angeles, where music was as much currency as glamour, Manson sought entry into the world of recording studios and stage lights. He dreamed of fame, of recognition for his songs, of becoming a voice that would echo beyond his commune in the desert. He brushed against the edges of Hollywood, meeting producers, musicians, actors, some of whom dismissed him, others of whom briefly entertained his ambitions. For a time, he hovered near those circles, a shadow figure, hoping for the chance that would never quite arrive. The rejection he faced hardened his resolve and twisted his vision. He began to see in Hollywood not opportunity, but betrayal. Not promise, but corruption. His mind, already fractured, wove together stories of apocalypse and judgment. He spoke of a coming war, of chaos that would cleanse the world, of himself as both herald and survivor. His family believed him. They followed him into the desert, into abandoned ranches, into the night rides where he whispered his visions. To the outside world, they were a curious band of wanderers. To themselves, they were chosen, set apart, called to fulfill a destiny that Manson alone defined. And so while Sharon arranged baby clothes in her nursery, while she prepared for the life within her, Manson sang to his family of destruction. While she dreamed of permanence, he dreamed of chaos. While she glowed with hope, he burned with resentment. Their worlds could not have been more different, and yet the currents of Los Angeles in 1969 carried them toward one another. For Sharon, unaware, the desert dust remained a distant image. For Manson, Hollywood was a fixation, a symbol of all he desired and despised. There's a chilling irony in the way their paths nearly crossed before that night of August. Manson sought entry through music, recording with those who knew others in Sharon's circle. He lingered near homes of Hollywood figures, including record producer Terry Melcher, who had once rented the very house Sharon would come to occupy on Cielo Drive. Manson visited that house, played his songs there, dreamed of being embraced by the world within its walls. When he was rejected, when the opportunity dissolved, resentment took root, and the house itself became a symbol of what he believed had been denied him. The low hum of Manson's songs, the strange half-melodies he sang to his followers, echoed in abandoned ranches and desert nights. They were not the polished music of Hollywood studios, but the hypnotic chants of a man whose power lay in control, not creation. His family listened, swayed, obeyed, surrendering their will to his vision. In their eyes, he was more than man. He was prophet, leader, almost divine. In truth, he was broken, angry, and dangerous, his charisma masking his cruelty. For Sharon, none of this was visible. Her world was filled with light, with the anticipation of motherhood, with the companionship of friends who gathered at her home. The hum of Manson's songs did not reach her ears, yet they echoed nearby, vibrating through the city, carried on the same winds that brought desert dust into polished neighborhoods. It was as though two worlds existed side by side in Los Angeles, one of hope and light, one of resentment and darkness, each moving closer without awareness of the other. It is difficult in telling her story not to pause here in reflection. How many lives move in parallel, unaware of the others that will one day shape their fate? How often does the laughter of one household coexist with the plotting of another, separated only by distance too small to measure? Sharon's life, filled with hope, and Manson's world, filled with delusion, were destined to collide. And yet in this moment before their paths converged, they remained unaware, each inhabiting their own fragile reality. The hum of Manson's songs lingers as we close this part of the story. It is a sound unsettling and unresolved, a reminder that darkness often hides itself in melodies, that danger sometimes comes not with thunder, but with whispers. Sharon's hand still rests upon her unborn child, her heart still filled with dreams. Beyond her gates, in ranches and deserts, the hum continues, carrying with it the seeds of a nightmare yet to unfold. The low hum of Manson's strange songs fades into silence, and in that silence another sound rises. An unanswered telephone at Cielo Drive, its ring cutting through the stillness of a house that waited with its mistress. It was the summer of 1969, and Sharon Tate, heavy with child, passed her days in a mixture of anticipation and loneliness. Roman was away in London, absorbed in his work, and though friends often gathered to keep her company, there remained a quiet emptiness that no laughter could entirely fill. The telephone became a symbol of that longing. Each time it rang, it might be his voice, it might be the comfort of connection. But often, too often, it was not, and the unanswered call lingered in the rooms like a reminder of absence. Her days followed gentle patterns. She arranged and rearranged the nursery, folding tiny clothes, adjusting blankets, imagining how it would feel to hold her child in her arms. Friends visited, bringing with them warmth and distraction. Yet when they departed, the house returned to silence, broken only by the ticking of clocks, the hum of distant traffic, the soft movements of a woman who waited. She was luminous still, her beauty deepened by pregnancy, her face serene, even in solitude. But beneath the serenity was a yearning, a desire for Roman's return, for the completeness of shared joy that distance continually denied. Those who knew her in those months spoke of her patience. She did not complain loudly, nor did she dwell in bitterness. She loved Roman, and she believed in the future they were building together. Yet her eyes, at times, betrayed her heart's longing. In letters and calls, she told him of her days, of the preparations for their child, of her hopes for his return before the birth. There was tenderness in her words, but also an unspoken plea. Be here with me. Share this with me. Do not let me wait alone. The house at Cielo Drive reflected both her warmth and her solitude. It was filled with light, with flowers, with the soft presence of a woman who created beauty wherever she went. Friends found it welcoming, a place of laughter and ease when they visited. Yet in the quiet hours, it was also a house of waiting, its wide rooms holding the silence of absence. Sharon moved through it with grace, her hand resting often on her belly, as though speaking silently to the life within, as though telling her child that even in loneliness, love was present. The city beyond her gates was restless, as we have seen, but Sharon remained in her own sphere of anticipation. She was aware of the turbulence of the age, the protests, the violence, the counterculture, but her focus was inward, on the child, on the hope of Roman's return, on the dream of family that had sustained her through years of impermanence. Perhaps she believed, as many do, that the turmoil of the world could not penetrate the sanctuary of home. Perhaps she trusted that love and patience were enough to keep the shadows at bay. There is something profoundly human in her waiting. All expectant mothers live between hope and uncertainty, between joy and fear. Sharon's experience was no different, yet hers was marked by the added weight of absence. She bore it quietly, with the resilience that had shaped her since childhood, but it remained with her, like the unanswered telephone, like the silence that followed each ring. Her friends, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, often came to her side. They provided companionship, laughter, a sense of family in Roman's absence. To Sharon, their presence was a comfort, a reminder that she was not entirely alone. Yet even amid their laughter, she longed for the one voice that could not be replaced. Roman's absence stretched across the weeks like a shadow, a reminder that love, however deep, is never free from distance. The summer light in Los Angeles was bright, almost harsh, casting long shadows across the hills. Sharon walked in her garden, sat on her porch, gazed at the horizon with the quiet patience of one who waits. She was not restless, for her nature was never restless, but contemplative, accepting, filled with hope even as absence weighed upon her. The unanswered telephone remained a symbol of this time, its ring cutting through the air, its silence lingering when no voice replied. We pause here, with the image of Sharon in her home, the light falling gently through the windows, the sound of a telephone unanswered echoing softly in the background. She rests her hand upon her unborn child, her eyes serene, her heart filled with longing and hope. Outside, the city hums with unrest. The desert dust still drifts. The strange songs still echo on the fringes. But within her home, for now, there is only waiting, only the tender silence of expectation. The unanswered telephone at Cielo Drive fades into the night, and in its place another sound rises, carried on the quiet of August air, the low hum of an engine climbing toward the hills. Headlights cut through the darkness, beams of pale light tracing the curves of the road as they ascended higher and higher. It was the night of August 8, 1969, and within the house at 150 Cielo Drive, Sharon Tate and her friends gathered, unaware of the approach of shadows. The evening itself had begun with ordinary ease, the kind of ease that belongs to summer nights, filled with conversation, with small pleasures, with the gentle anticipation of a child soon to be born. Sharon was 8 months pregnant, her body heavy, her face still radiant in its serenity. She had invited friends to keep her company during Roman's absence: Jay Sebring, her former fiancé and devoted friend, Abigail Folger, heiress and philanthropist, and Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer and companion to Abigail. Together they filled the house with light and conversation. Neighbors later remembered hearing music faintly drifting from the home, the laughter of voices mingling with it, the kind of sound that carries warmth even in the distance. The house itself seemed to hold the glow of Sharon's expectation. Photographs from those days show her smiling gently, her hand always near her belly, her beauty softened by the presence of the child she awaited. Her friends, though each carrying their own burdens, found comfort in her presence. There was no grand celebration that night, no extravagant gathering. It was simply an evening of companionship, of being together in a world that was already shifting in ways none of them could see. Outside the gates, however, the headlights continued their climb. The city below lay quiet, its millions unaware of what was unfolding. In the distance, the desert from which the visitors had come stretched silent, its dust now carried into the very heart of Hollywood's hills. Those inside the car were not friends, not guests, but followers of Charles Manson, drawn into his vision of destruction, carrying with them the twisted purpose he had instilled. Inside the house, Sharon may have felt a mixture of joy and weariness. The days of late pregnancy are long and heavy, filled with anticipation, filled with the hope of the child's imminent arrival. Perhaps she sat on the couch, adjusting her posture for comfort, listening to Jay's stories, smiling at Abigail's warmth, resting in the companionship of those she trusted. Perhaps she thought of Roman, far away in London, and imagined how soon he would return, how soon he would join her in welcoming their child. The night was ordinary, yet within its ordinariness there was a tenderness, a sense of pause before the great change of birth. It is haunting to reflect on how fragile such moments are. The laughter of friends, the quiet music, the simple comfort of companionship, all of it can seem eternal in its peace, and yet it hangs by a thread we cannot see. Outside, the headlights neared, turning onto the road that led to the gate of Cielo Drive. The visitors carried with them not laughter, but silence, not companionship, but destruction. They were bound not by love, but by delusion, not by family, but by the command of one man whose voice had twisted their will. And yet, to Sharon and her companions, the night was still gentle, still ordinary. They could not hear the car as it climbed, could not see the beams of light cutting through the darkness. They remained in their sanctuary, unaware that the shadows were drawing near. This is the tragedy of such moments. The innocence of those inside persists until the very last breath, the very last sound, the very last heartbeat. The headlights reached the gate. The engine quieted. The figures stepped out, their footsteps muffled on the gravel, their voices low. Beyond the gate, the house stood glowing, filled with warmth, filled with hope. The two worlds, the world of Sharon's expectation and the world of Manson's delusion, stood only steps apart, about to collide. We pause here, in this moment of unbearable stillness, where the laughter inside has not yet been broken, where the headlights outside have not yet intruded. The night hangs suspended, the air heavy, the silence deep. Sharon rests her hand upon her unborn child. Her friends sit nearby and the house holds its glow. Beyond the gate, the shadows gather, the footsteps approach, the beams of light fade as the engine stills. It is in this fragile, unresolved instant that we leave them, suspended between innocence and horror, between laughter and silence, between life and its undoing. The headlights that had climbed the hill faded into darkness, and from that silence there rose a single cry, a cry that broke the fragile stillness of Cielo Drive, a cry that marked the moment when innocence was shattered and horror descended. The night of August 8th became the dawn of August 9th, 1969, and within those hours the sanctuary Sharon had built was violated by forces that carried with them only chaos and destruction. Yet to tell this moment requires restraint, for the violence itself, unspeakable in its detail, is not what lingers most in memory. It is the silence that followed, the emptiness left behind, the stillness that descended when life was extinguished. The intruders moved through the house with a brutality that defies comprehension. They were not guided by reason, nor by personal grievance against Sharon or her companions, but by the distorted commands of a man whose delusions had become their faith. To them, this house was not a home, but a symbol. Not a place of warmth, but a stage upon which to enact destruction. The motives they carried were tangled in madness, in resentment, in visions of apocalypse that made no sense to the world beyond their circle. Yet the outcome was simple and devastating. Lives ended, light extinguished, hope crushed. Sharon, heavy with child, found herself face to face with a terror she could never have imagined. Accounts speak of her pleas for mercy, of her desire to save her unborn child, of her final moments marked not by anger, but by desperation to protect the life within her. There is a dignity in these fragments, a glimpse of her heart even in the face of horror. She asked, not for herself alone, but for the child she carried, for the dream of permanence she had longed for all her life. The refusal she met is perhaps the cruelest detail of all, a reminder that the capacity for compassion can be lost entirely when minds are consumed by delusion. Her companions, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, each faced the same terror, each met the same fate. Together they were bound not only by friendship, but by the circumstance of that night, by the intrusion that united them in death. The house that had been filled with music and laughter only hours before became a place of silence, its walls bearing witness to a violence that cannot be undone. Outside, the city slept unaware. Inside, the light was gone. It is here that one must pause, not to linger on the brutality, but to reflect on what such moments mean. How fragile is the distance between laughter and silence, between life and its end. How easily the sanctuary of home can be pierced by shadows from beyond. Sharon's story, which had carried her from the transience of childhood to the promise of motherhood, was cut short not by fate alone, but by the choices of others who had surrendered their humanity. There is no explanation that can satisfy, no reason that can justify. There is only the sorrow of lives lost, of dreams undone, of beauty destroyed. And yet, even here, one must not reduce Sharon to the role of victim alone. To do so is to let the violence define her. She was more than the night of August 9th. She was the child who gazed out at horizons, the young woman who walked cobblestone streets in Italy, the actress who brought vulnerability to her roles, the wife who loved with devotion, the mother-to-be who glowed with anticipation. Her life was a tapestry of light, and though its final thread was torn, the pattern remains visible. We must see her not only in her end, but in all the moments that preceded it, in the fullness of who she was. The silence that followed the cry is what lingers most. Neighbors recalled an uncanny stillness, as though even nature recoiled from what had occurred. The hillside that had been filled with ordinary night sounds, crickets, wind, the occasional bark of a dog, was suddenly subdued, as if the world itself held its breath. That silence is more haunting than the violence, for it is the silence of absence, the silence of lives extinguished. It is the silence that would echo long after in the hearts of those who loved Sharon, in the memory of a city that awoke to horror, in the history that cannot forget. To imagine the house in those early hours is to imagine stillness. Rooms once filled with warmth now emptied, voices once filled with laughter now silenced, light once glowing now dimmed. The house stood as a witness, silent and unmoving, its very walls soaked in the tragedy it had contained. And as dawn approached, the world outside remained unaware, the city continuing in its rhythm, oblivious to the shadow that had fallen upon one of its brightest stars. We leave this part of the story not with detail, but with absence, with the image of a house now silent, its glow extinguished, its rooms holding nothing but stillness. A single cry has faded, the intruders have gone, and what remains is only the silence that follows horror, the silence that speaks more powerfully than words can ever convey. The silence that settled in the house on Cielo Drive, heavy and unbroken, did not last long in the wider world. By morning, voices began to rise again, though not in laughter or music, but in alarm and disbelief. Police arrived to find the scene, and from that moment the tragedy no longer belonged only to those within the house. It belonged to the city, the nation, and soon the world. The discovery spread quickly, and with it came confusion, rumor, and sorrow. Within hours, the silence of the hillside was replaced by the clatter of typewriters, the whir of printing presses, and the rustle of newspapers rolling off machines, carrying headlines that stunned those who read them. On August 9th, 1969, Los Angeles awoke to the news of unspeakable violence. 5 slain in Beverly Hills, the papers declared, their words stark, their details incomplete. The victims were named one by one: Sharon Tate, actress, 8 months pregnant; Jay Sebring, hairstylist to the stars; Abigail Folger, heiress; Wojciech Frykowski, writer, Stephen Parent, a young man visiting by chance. The shock of Sharon's name drew the most attention. She was not only an actress, not only a figure of rising fame, but also the wife of director Roman Polanski, a young woman who had seemed the very embodiment of promise. The fact that she was carrying a child made the tragedy unbearable, almost incomprehensible. The press swarmed, their cameras clicking, their pens scratching out fragments of story. Neighbors spoke in whispers, recalling what they had heard, what they had seen, what they had feared. Some said they had noticed nothing, that the night had seemed quiet. Others claimed to have heard strange noises, cries, the sound of disturbance. But in truth, no one had grasped the enormity of what was unfolding only a few yards from their homes. The city was shaken awake, its illusions pierced. For if violence could reach into the very heart of Hollywood's hills, into the home of beauty and promise, then it could reach anywhere. Roman, still in London, received the news with disbelief. Friends had to tell him gently, but even then the reality was too harsh to accept. He returned to Los Angeles soon after, but in those first hours his grief was shared by many who had never met him, never met Sharon, yet felt the loss as though it were personal. The image of her, luminous and expectant, was fresh in the minds of audiences. To imagine her gone was to feel a kind of collective mourning, a recognition that beauty and innocence can be destroyed in an instant. The newspapers carried photographs of Sharon smiling, photographs from films, from premieres, from moments when her life had seemed to glitter. These images contrasted cruelly with the headlines of her death. Readers stared at her face, radiant and gentle, and tried to reconcile it with the horror described in ink. The contradiction was too great, the dissonance too sharp. And so the city fell into a kind of stunned silence, punctuated only by the endless churning of rumor. For rumor rose quickly. At first, the motive was unclear. Some speculated that the killings were connected to drugs. Others whispered of cults, of sinister forces moving in the shadows of Hollywood. The details were too strange, too violent to fit ordinary explanations. The word ritual appeared in some reports, massacre in others. People locked their doors, pulled curtains tighter, looked with suspicion at strangers. Fear spread across Los Angeles like smoke from a fire, invisible yet choking. And yet, amid the chaos of speculation, the grief for Sharon was real and steady. Those who had known her spoke to reporters of her kindness, her gentleness, her patience. They remembered the girl who had once been shy, who had grown into a woman of grace, who had spoken often of her dream of motherhood. They told of her smile, of her laughter, of the light she brought into rooms. These words could not undo what had happened, but they served as a counterweight to the darkness, reminders that Sharon was more than a victim, more than a headline. She was a person, loved and remembered. The presses did not stop. Day after day, new stories appeared, each carrying fresh details, fresh speculations, fresh grief. The images of Cielo Drive, police cars flashing lights, gates half open, became burned into the memory of the city. The newspapers became more than reports. They became memorials, testimonies to lives cut short, records of a tragedy that seemed to symbolize the end of an era. For many, the murders marked the close of the 1960s, the death of innocence, the moment when dreams of peace and love gave way to fear and disillusionment. The rustle of newspapers in the hands of readers carried with it the weight of mourning. Families at breakfast tables read aloud the names, shaking their heads in disbelief. Actors and directors, producers and fans, all found themselves bound together in sorrow. Sharon's face stared back from front pages, a face that seemed too alive, too full of promise, to be associated with death. The ink that printed her name, the photographs that showed her smile, became fragments of history, fragile attempts to capture what had already been lost. And so this part of her story closes with the image of newspapers rolling endlessly from their presses, the sound of machines filling the air as the city awoke to horror. Headlines screamed of murder, photographs whispered of beauty, and the people of Los Angeles sat stunned, reading words they could scarcely believe. The silence of the house on Cielo Drive had become the noise of a city in mourning, a city that would never be the same. The newspapers rolling endlessly from their presses gave way to another sound, distant yet eternal, the sound of ocean waves in exile. For Roman Polanski, who returned to Los Angeles after the murder of his wife and unborn child, grief did not speak in words, but in rhythms, in the ceaseless crashing of water against shorelines, in the restless movement of tides that mirrored his own unrest. The world saw him as a celebrated director, but in those days he was a man unmoored, a figure wandering between public devastation and private unraveling, carried by grief as one is carried by an undertow. When Roman stepped again into the city, the weight of what had happened was already pressing upon him. Sharon's face was everywhere, in the newspapers, in the voices of reporters, in the whispers of strangers. The image of her smile had become a symbol of loss, and for him, each repetition was another blow. He visited the house at Cielo Drive, now marked forever by tragedy, and what he saw there has been described as unbearable. To walk into rooms where laughter once lived and find only echoes of absence is to know grief in its most relentless form. Publicly, Roman spoke of his devastation. He gave interviews in which his voice trembled, his eyes heavy, his words carrying the weight of sorrow. He told the world of his love for Sharon, of the child they had awaited, of the cruelty of what had been taken from him. He was not a man who hid his grief behind silence. He allowed it to be seen, perhaps because it was too great to conceal. Yet the very act of sharing it meant that his mourning was no longer private. He grieved under the gaze of millions, his sorrow made into headlines, his tears into spectacles. Privately, his pain ran deeper still. Friends recalled how he withdrew, how he seemed restless, unable to find peace. He surrounded himself with others at times, perhaps to escape solitude, but the shadow of loss never left him. The waves of grief rose and fell, sometimes leaving him numb, sometimes overwhelming him with memories. In his mind, Sharon remained alive, her presence vivid, her absence intolerable. He spoke of dreams in which she appeared, dreams in which the child was still to be born, dreams that dissolved upon waking into the silence of reality. The ocean became a symbol of his grief. He had often been drawn to water, to the restless horizon, to the sense of vastness that mirrored his own ambition. Now in exile from happiness, the sea seemed to speak his sorrow. The waves rose and fell as grief rises and falls, never ending, never still, always pulling, always carrying. For Roman, there was no permanence in his mourning, only movement, only the ceaseless rhythm of loss. The public, too, became restless in their gaze upon him. Some offered sympathy, others suspicion, for in tragedies of such magnitude, people often seek explanations, culprits, stories to make sense of the senseless. Roman's foreignness, his eccentricities, his reputation for brilliance and indulgence, all these made him a subject of both compassion and speculation. He bore it as best he could, yet the scrutiny only deepened his isolation. Grief shared with the world is not softened. It is magnified, made more unbearable by the inability to keep it sacred. And still, through it all, his love for Sharon remained the core of his mourning. He spoke of her beauty, of her kindness, of her gentleness. He remembered the way she laughed, the way she carried herself with grace, the way she longed for motherhood. His sorrow was not abstract but intimate, filled with details of the life they had shared, the home they had built, the dreams they had spoken aloud. He grieved not only for what was lost, but for what would never be, the child who would never be born, the years of companionship that would never unfold, the permanence Sharon had longed for that would never come. The waves of grief carried him far from peace, and in the years that followed, he would drift in ways both destructive and creative. His films bore traces of his loss. His personal life reflected his restlessness. His choices revealed the mark of a man wounded beyond repair. Yet in this moment of the story, in the days and weeks following Sharon's death, he was simply a man undone, standing at the edge of an ocean of sorrow, unable to step back, unable to move forward, carried only by the relentless tide. We leave him here, by the water's edge, the waves crashing endlessly, the sound filling the silence that grief had left behind. Roman's figure is small against the horizon, his heart heavy, his eyes searching for a permanence he cannot find. The sea swallows his cries, carrying them into its depths, returning only its own ceaseless rhythm. It is in this rhythm that his mourning will live, not as a moment to be resolved, but as an endless movement, an exile from happiness that no passage of time can undo. The sound of ocean waves pulling endlessly at the shore fades, and in its place comes another sound, metallic, unyielding, final, the clinking of prison bars. It was within these confines and in the courtrooms of Los Angeles that the story of Sharon Tate's death and the fate of her companions was turned into spectacle. The world had not only lost them, it now demanded to understand, to see justice enacted, to look upon the faces of those who had carried out such unfathomable acts. And what the world saw in that courtroom was as unsettling as the crime itself. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers began in 1970, only months after Sharon's death, yet it carried the weight of centuries of human darkness. The defendants, Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and later Charles Tex Watson, entered the courtroom not with shame, but often with defiance. They sang, they smiled, they carved symbols into their foreheads, their behavior turning the solemnity of justice into theater. To the families of the victims, to a city still raw with grief, it was unbearable, like watching mockery made of suffering. To the wider world, it was both grotesque and mesmerizing, a drama that seemed to reveal how fragile the boundaries of civilization truly are. Manson himself, small in stature yet heavy with presence, commanded attention. His eyes were sharp, darting, filled with a strange intensity that seemed to draw his followers even within the confines of the law. He spoke of visions, of revolutions, of prophecies that had guided him. His words were tangled, often nonsensical, but to those already under his sway, they were gospel. To the courtroom, they were evidence of madness and manipulation. The world watched as his image, wild-eyed, bearded, magnetic in the darkest sense, became the face of evil in an era already filled with turmoil. Sharon's name, and the names of her companions, were spoken again and again in that courtroom. Their final moments were described in detail, their pleas, their suffering, their innocence placed against the cruelty of those who took their lives. For Sharon's family, for Roman, for the friends who loved her, it was a reopening of wounds that could never truly heal. The courtroom became a place where absence was spoken into presence, where those who were lost lived again only through the recounting of their deaths. The testimony of former family members revealed the depth of Manson's control. Young women described how he drew them in with promises of love and belonging, how he stripped away their will and replaced it with his own. They spoke of nights in the desert, of songs and visions, of rituals that blurred the line between devotion and destruction. They spoke of how he directed them, how he commanded them to carry out the killings, how they believed they were enacting a destiny larger than themselves. To the jury, to the public, these words were both horrifying and bewildering. How could ordinary young people be transformed into instruments of such violence? How could the longing for belonging become so twisted? The clinking of prison bars reminded the world that justice, however imperfect, still sought to answer violence with consequence. Manson and his followers were convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Though later, with California's abolition of the death penalty, their sentences became life imprisonment. The courtroom, once filled with their songs and defiance, was left silent as the bars closed upon them. Yet even as the law confined them, the shadow of their actions lingered. The fear they had unleashed, the innocence they had destroyed, could not be so neatly contained. For Sharon's family, the trial was both necessity and torment. Her mother, Doris Tate, emerged from grief with a resolve that astonished many. She attended hearings. She spoke publicly. She became a voice not only for Sharon, but for all victims. Her presence was a quiet defiance against the spectacle of Manson's family. Where they sang and mocked, she bore dignity. Where they carved symbols of madness, she carried memory. In time, her activism would shape laws and bring strength to others. But in those early days, it was simply a mother's refusal to let her daughter's life be forgotten. The world, too, carried the weight of the trial. Newspapers printed daily updates. Cameras recorded each bizarre outburst. Commentators spoke of the end of innocence, of the dark turn of the 1960s. The words Manson Family entered the language as a symbol of chaos, of cultic madness, of the terrifying ease with which charisma can distort the human soul. And in the midst of it all, Sharon's name remained central, a reminder of what had been lost, of beauty destroyed, of promise cut short. Yet as the clinking of bars signaled the end of the trial, questions lingered. Why had such a man gained such power? Why had his visions taken root in the hearts of so many? Why had the lives of Sharon and her companions been chosen as the stage for his madness? The law could convict, but it could not explain. The jury could decide guilt, but it could not answer the haunting silence of Cielo Drive. Those questions remained, drifting like dust through the air, settling uneasily in the minds of all who followed the story. And so we close this part of her story with the sound of bars closing, of keys turning in locks, of justice rendered yet incomplete. Manson and his followers were confined, their songs silenced, their madness contained behind walls. But the silence that replaced their defiance was not peace. It was the silence of unanswered questions, the silence of grief that persists, the silence that follows even when judgment has been pronounced. The clinking of prison bars fades, and in its place rises another sound, softer, gentler, the faint flicker of candle flames, each one trembling in vigil. For though Sharon Tate's life had been cut short, her memory endured, carried not only in photographs and films, but in the hearts of those who loved her. In the years after the trial, when the world's attention shifted restlessly to new stories, her family remained steadfast, keeping her name alive in ways both tender and unyielding. And at the center of this devotion was her mother, Doris Tate, who transformed her grief into a force of activism that would ripple far beyond her own sorrow. In the immediate aftermath of Sharon's death, Doris was undone, as any mother would be. The loss of a daughter is a wound that cannot be measured, and the manner of Sharon's passing only deepened the pain. For a time, she lived in the silence of mourning, surrounded by memories that brought both comfort and torment. Photographs of Sharon as a child, letters written during her adolescence, images of her smiling on screen, each fragment reminded Doris of what had been taken. Yet within that grief, something stirred, a determination not to let Sharon's life be defined solely by her end. When the trials of the Manson family ended, many might have wished to turn away, to close the door on the horror. But Doris refused. She attended parole hearings, year after year, confronting those who had been part of the destruction of her daughter's life. She stood in courtrooms, her voice steady, her presence a reminder that Sharon was not a symbol or a headline, but a daughter, a sister, a woman whose life mattered. In doing so, Doris gave voice not only to her own grief, but to the grief of countless others whose loved ones had been lost to violence. It was from this resolve that the victims' rights movement in America found one of its most powerful advocates. Doris spoke publicly, she lobbied lawmakers, she worked tirelessly to ensure that victims and their families were not forgotten in the machinery of justice. Her activism led to reforms, to changes in law, to greater recognition of the voices of those left behind. In this way, Sharon's memory became a catalyst for change, her light shining through the determination of her mother. What had begun in silence grew into a movement, and what had been born of sorrow became a source of strength for many. The candle flames of vigil became a recurring image in those years. On anniversaries, on public occasions, on quiet nights of remembrance, people gathered with candles to honor Sharon and the others lost at Cielo Drive. Each flame was small, fragile, flickering in the night wind, yet together they created light that defied darkness. Those who gathered spoke of Sharon's beauty, of her kindness, of the promise that had been stolen. They spoke, too, of the need for justice, for remembrance, for the refusal to let such lives be reduced to silence. Roman Polanski, though his grief carried him into troubled paths, also remembered Sharon in his own ways. In interviews, in films, in private words, he spoke of her as the love of his life, the woman whose absence had marked him forever. Others who had known her, friends, colleagues, neighbors, carried her memory in stories, in photographs, in the simple act of remembering her with tenderness rather than horror. Slowly, amid the noise of the world, the image of Sharon as victim gave way once more to the image of Sharon as woman, radiant, kind, luminous in her gentleness. For her family, remembrance was not only personal, but public. Doris and later Sharon's sisters worked to ensure that her name was never forgotten, that her story was told with dignity, that her legacy was not only one of tragedy, but of change. In time, the Sharon Tate Victims' Rights Foundation was created, a testament to this commitment. The foundation worked to support others who had endured loss, to give them voice, to ensure that their pain was recognized in the halls of justice. Through this, Sharon's life extended beyond her own years, touching countless others in ways she could never have imagined. And yet, amid the activism and the vigils, there remained the simple act of remembrance. For Doris, for Sharon's sisters, for those who had loved her, memory lived not only in speeches and laws, but in quiet moments, looking at old photographs, recalling the sound of Sharon's laughter, imagining the child she never held. Memory is not only grand, but intimate, carried in details too small for the world to notice, but too precious to those who hold them to ever let go. The candle flames flickered against the night, fragile yet enduring. Each one symbolized not only Sharon, but all who are lost, all who are remembered, all who are loved still. They flickered because light, like life, is never still, always trembling, always vulnerable. Yet they endured because love, like flame, resists the darkness even when surrounded by it. Sharon's memory became such a flame, trembling yet unextinguished, carried by those who refused to let her story end in silence. And so we leave this part of her story with the image of candles glowing in vigil, their flames swaying gently, their light reflected in the eyes of those who remember. The courtroom has fallen silent, the bars have clinked closed, but in the stillness, light remains, fragile yet enduring, a testament to Sharon Tate's life and to the love that continues beyond her death. The flickering candle flames that glowed in vigil dim into darkness, and in their place appears another image, an empty movie theater. Rows of seats stretch into shadow, the air still carrying the faint scent of popcorn and dust, the screen looming silent, white, waiting for light to fill it. This is where Sharon Tate's presence lingers most tangibly, not in the noise of trials or the headlines of newspapers, but in the fragile permanence of film. For though her life was brief, her face and voice remain preserved on celluloid, flickering into motion whenever the projector hums to life. Her film legacy is not vast in number, yet within it one finds traces of her essence, glimpses of the woman she was, hints of the woman she might have become. In Eye of the Devil, she moved with ethereal grace, her presence cloaked in mystery, her beauty lending the film an otherworldly quality. In The Fearless Vampire Killers, she revealed both playfulness and allure, her laughter echoing within a film that was both parody and love letter to Gothic cinema. In Don't Make Waves, she embodied the Californian dream, radiant beneath the sun, yet already showing the paradox of being admired more for image than for depth. And in Valley of the Dolls, as Jennifer North, she gave her most haunting performance, blending vulnerability with radiance, embodying a woman admired yet diminished, cherished yet misunderstood. Audiences who watch these films today often see more than the roles themselves. They see Sharon, luminous in her youth, carrying within her a gentleness that transcends the scripts. They see her patience, her humility, her quiet grace shimmering through even when the roles themselves were limited. They wonder what she might have become had time allowed, what performances she might have given, what depth she might have revealed if given the chance to move beyond the mask of beauty. In this way, her films are both presence and absence, a record of what was and a reminder of what might have been. Hollywood, too, carries her legacy in memory. She is remembered as a symbol of innocence destroyed, but also as a woman who embodied the shimmering beauty of an era now gone. Her story became entwined with the story of the 1960s themselves, an age that began in hope and ended in disillusionment, an age of dreams that gave way to darker realities. Sharon, with her luminous presence, came to symbolize the fragile promise of that time, a promise shattered but never forgotten. Cultural memory is never simple. Some remember her through the lens of tragedy, her name bound to the Manson murders, her face forever associated with horror. Others insist on remembering her in life, in laughter, in the glow of motherhood that she carried in her final months. Still others remember her through her family's activism, through Doris Tate's voice, through the movement for victims' rights that grew from her absence. Each memory is partial, each incomplete, yet together they weave a tapestry of remembrance that ensures she is never entirely lost. The empty movie theater reminds us of the strange permanence of film. An audience departs, the seats empty, the screen returns to white, yet the image remains preserved, ready to return at the flick of a switch. Sharon's presence, too, remains. She can be seen again and again, smiling, speaking, moving across the screen, as though untouched by time. Yet we know, as we watch, that time has claimed her, that what we see is not present, but memory. This paradox is the essence of legacy, to remain visible even in absence, to be alive in art even in death. For younger generations, Sharon is often encountered first as a name within history, tied to the tragedy that ended her life. Only later do they discover her films, her interviews, her photographs, and through them they glimpse the woman behind the myth. They see her not as victim, but as person, gentle, patient, radiant in her ordinariness as much as in her beauty. In this way, each viewing of her work is an act of reclamation, a way of seeing her anew, apart from the shadows that history has cast upon her. What, then, is her legacy? It is many things at once. It is the legacy of an actress whose talent was only beginning to unfold. It is the legacy of a woman whose life became entwined with one of the darkest crimes of the century. It is the legacy of a family who turned grief into activism, ensuring that the voices of victims are heard. And it is the legacy of memory itself, the way beauty lingers, the way kindness endures, the way presence can be felt even when absent. The empty movie theater with its silent screen becomes a symbol of this paradox. The film has ended, the light has faded, the audience has departed, yet the memory remains, waiting for the next showing, the next witness, the next act of remembrance. Sharon's presence, too, waits in this way, always gone, yet always ready to return in memory, in film, in the stories of those who loved her. And so we close this part of her story with the image of that theater, the screen fading slowly to white, the seats empty, the air silent. The performance has ended, yet the presence remains, suspended in memory, trembling between absence and return. The white screen of the empty theater fades into another image, one older than any film, older than memory itself, a star trembling in the night sky. It is distant, its light fragile, yet it shines across centuries, across immeasurable space, reaching eyes that were never meant to see it. So too does Sharon Tate's presence endure. Not only in film reels and photographs, not only in headlines and histories, but in the quiet persistence of memory, the way light continues to travel long after its source has been extinguished. Hers is a story that trembles between innocence and horror, between beauty and brutality, between light and the shadows that sought to consume it. When one speaks her name today, it often arrives weighted with contradiction. She is remembered as a victim, yet she was so much more. She is remembered for her beauty, yet her life carried gentleness that words rarely capture. She is remembered in connection with Charles Manson, though her life was never his to define. Memory, like the trembling star, flickers between clarity and distortion, revealing truth in one moment and obscuring it in another. And yet through it all, Sharon remains, luminous, fragile, enduring. Her story is a meditation on the fragility of life itself. She was a child who lived in constant movement, learning patience through the silence of departures. She was a young woman who bore the mask of beauty, admired yet often unseen. She was an actress who revealed vulnerability on screen, hinting at depths that the world never fully allowed her to explore. She was a wife who loved with devotion, even when her marriage was marked by imbalance. She was a mother-to-be who glowed with anticipation, her hand always resting gently on the life within her. Each chapter of her life was filled with both promise and longing, each step moving toward a permanence she never fully found. And then came the shadow, sudden and senseless, cutting short not only her life, but the life of her child, silencing her laughter, extinguishing her light. Yet even in that silence, her presence did not vanish. It lingered in grief, in memory, in the voices of those who refused to let her be forgotten. It lingered in the activism of her mother, who turned sorrow into strength, ensuring that victims' voices would never again be so easily silenced. It lingered in film, where her image still moves, still smiles, still speaks to those who watch. And it lingers in cultural memory, where her name is spoken as both warning and remembrance, both sorrow and tenderness. What does Sharon Tate symbolize now? To some, she is the embodiment of innocence destroyed, a reminder of how fragile beauty and hope can be in the face of violence. To others, she is a symbol of resilience, for her memory inspired a movement. Her absence became the spark for change. Her life continues to touch countless others, and to many, she is simply Sharon, a woman who lived, who laughed, who dreamed of motherhood, who deserved more years than she was given. The star that trembles in the night sky is distant, yet its light reaches us still. We do not know when it was first set aflame, nor when it faded, only that its light continues to travel, unchanged by time. Sharon's life is like that. Though it ended abruptly in 1969, the light of her presence continues to reach us, through film, through memory, through the voices of those who speak her name with tenderness. Her star is not extinguished. It trembles, yes, but it shines. As we close this telling, we are left not with answers, but with questions. Why do some lives shine so brightly yet end so soon? Why is beauty so often fragile, so often bound to sorrow? Why does memory linger in some names and fade in others? These are questions without certainty, yet they are the questions Sharon's story compels us to ask. And in asking them, we honor her. For to remember her is to resist the silence that sought to consume her. Imagine, then, the night sky above Los Angeles. The city hums below, restless and alive, its lights flickering like restless fireflies. But above the noise, above the shifting tides of history, a single star trembles, faint but steady. It is not the brightest star, nor the most enduring, but it is there. Its light crossing the distance, reaching those who pause to look upward. Sharon Tate's story is like that star, fragile, luminous, trembling, but unextinguished. And so we end here, with her light still visible, her memory still alive, her presence still felt. Sharon Tate, daughter, actress, wife, mother-to-be, victim, symbol, above all, a woman whose story continues to move us, whose star continues to shine across the silence of time.